So today the spotlight is on carbohydrates, or carbs as it's also commonly known. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what they are, which foods actually classify as carbohydrates, why we need them or don't need them, and also just to talk a little bit about some myths and so forth. So let's jump in. So carbohydrates or carbs have actually gotten quite a bad reputation over the past few years as being bad or unhealthy, or it's going to cause you to gain weight and so forth. But it's very important to understand why we need carbohydrates in the diet. So the first main reason for carbohydrates and why we need them is because they actually provide the brain with the preferred fuel source called glucose. So our brain prefers glucose to function on it, and yes, the brain can actually function on something else called ketones, which we get from fat, but unfortunately it's not as easily available as glucose would be, so it's often more recommended to get glucose and to feed the brain with glucose for concentration and so forth. So we know that we get glucose from carbohydrates, and that's basically what carbohydrates are. It's a group of sugars put together, so whether it's glucose or fructose or lactose or galactose or whatever the case may be, that is our carbohydrates. So on top of our fuel source, our major fuel source, it actually provides us with a lot of vitamins and minerals as well. The main reason for that is also because it's the biggest food group, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. So we get a lot of B vitamin C, your other types of minerals and so forth also from carbohydrates. So it's very important to also get that food group in, and if we're eliminating carbohydrates completely, we might be lacking in certain vitamins and minerals. Then another very important factor that carbohydrates actually provide to the body is fiber. So fiber, whether it's soluble or insoluble fiber, is very, very important for the body. And our main sources of fiber is, of course, fruits and vegetables and whole grains, which are all part of the carbohydrate group. So we know we get two types of fiber, just to quickly zoom in on fiber. So we get soluble fiber, and you can think about it as the jelly, sticky part. So when you let oats stand for a while, it becomes all gooey and sticky. That's our soluble fiber, and soluble fiber is very important for actually managing the blood cholesterol levels as well as the sugar levels, and it also helps to form the stool in the colon. And then also we have the insoluble fiber. You can think about the roughage, the crunchy part, the stringy part on celery, and that actually helps to get the stool out of the body. So we need both of the types of fiber in our diet, and we can mainly only get them from our carbohydrate sources. So that's mainly our biggest factors or roles that carbohydrate play in the body, and it's major roles because many of the things we actually can't get from any other food groups, like for example your fiber and your glucose. So let's talk a little bit about what which foods actually classify as carbohydrates, and this might surprise you a little bit, or you might already know this, but it's a good refresher. So the most common source of carbohydrates is, of course, our cereals and grains. So we often get this misperception that, if it's a healthy grain, it's not really classified as a carbohydrate for some reason, but that's not the case. So whether it's healthy or unhealthy in your mind, if it contains a grain or cereal, for example, it is a carbohydrate. So that includes your oats, your crackers, Provitas, your millipap. It's also your things like rice cakes or rice, brown or white rice, it doesn't matter, and your Wheat Bix and Cocoa Pops, or anything that contains either wheat, barley, rye, oats, sorghum, corn or cornstarch or mielie meal or whatever. So all of the grains and cereals, and of course bread. So what's easy to look at is when we're looking at one slice of bread that contains about 15 grams of carbohydrates, and it's easy to actually look at the other sources of carbohydrates and compare it to a slice of bread. So the next group of carbohydrates is, of course, fructose, so that we know is in the form of fruits. So all fruits contain fructose, and therefore all fruits are actually carbohydrates. So whether it's a berry or banana or papaya or lychee or dried fruit or juice, it is a carbohydrate because of the fact that it contains fructose. Yes, different fruits contain different amounts of fructose, and some may contain more than others. But the point stays the same, they all are carbohydrates. And what's very interesting to see is that one slice of bread is actually the equivalent in terms of carbohydrates to one portion of fruit. So if you have 6 fruits a day, you might as well have just as well had 6 slices of bread. Now, it's not as easy as that. It's just in terms of the carbohydrates. We know that fruits give us lots of beautiful colors, which is called phytonutrients, also giving us a lot of more vitamins and minerals and so forth. But in terms of carbohydrates on its own, it's literally the same. Now we know that different fruits, like I said, contain different amounts of fructose. So your berry and citrus fruits, of course, would contain less fructose. So you can typically have a bigger portion of them, but nevertheless, they all contain carbohydrates. The next group include our starchy vegetables. So we all know potato and sweet potato, and very fun fact, they're very similar in terms of their composition and so forth. So really, you don't need to be scared of the potato. You can have potato, you can have sweet potato, and also includes your butternut and pumpkin, beetroot, corn, and peas. Peas is one group I often see people forget about, or type of food that people think is just a vegetable and not a carbohydrate. Now, looking at your green leafy veggies and broccoli and mushrooms and tomatoes and so forth, they do still contain carbohydrates, but at a very much lower amount. So we typically don't classify them as a full carbohydrate group. We'd rather classify them as free foods or your veggies, basically, because the amount of carbohydrates in them is quite low. What's also nice is under the starchy veggies, we also get all your legumes, like your chickpeas and lentils, black beans, kidney beans, and so forth. So all of them also classify as carbohydrates. And again, 3 baby potatoes would be typically the same amount of carbohydrates as 1 slice of bread, for example. Moving on to dairy. Dairy is also a group we commonly forget about as containing lactose, which is a type of carbohydrate. So again, 1 cup of milk has almost 3 grams less carbohydrates than a slice of bread. So again, very similar, but we know dairy also contains protein and fat, but that includes our yogurt, cream, cheese, and so forth. All of that also contain carbohydrates. And then lastly, we know our sugar and honey, maple syrup, agave syrup, all the types of sweeteners that you get that's not non-nutritive sweeteners, like honey and sugar and so forth. And anything that contains sugar or has sugar added would then classify as a carbohydrate. So you see that it is really a very big group. It's mainly all the foods we eat except protein, like meat, and also your fat, like avocados and olives and nuts and so forth. And then, of course, your green leafy veggies or your non-starchy veggies, which still contain carbohydrates, but at a very much lower amount. So that's why it's so important to not cut out carbohydrates out of your diet, because then you're limiting your diet completely to only a few certain amounts of foods, and you also might be putting yourself at risk of developing certain deficiencies in nutrients and fiber, which also increases your risk for constipation, which increases your risk for colon cancer, which then also doesn't manage the blood sugar levels as well, and it's just going on and on. So it's really important to have carbohydrates in your diet. And yes, we do get carbohydrates that are lower in GI or glycemic index, and others that are higher in GI. And we know that it is better where you can to opt for the lower GI options, because those options will actually release their sugar slower into the body, which means that it won't cause a spike in the blood sugar levels and then a rapid drop, which then typically leads to cravings or also an increased risk for storing fat. So it is better to go for your lower GI options, which are most typically your minimally processed options, your starchy veggies, your fruits with, let's say, a protein portion or a fat portion with it, and then of course your brown rice and your whole grain options. So that's basically carbohydrates. So carbohydrates aren't bad, we need them in the diet. It's just important to note that they have a specific role to play, and we need to be mindful of which foods actually do contain carbohydrates or fall under the carbohydrate group. And it's very important to keep on consuming them, because it makes the diet nice and diverse and sustainable. So I hope this has been informative. Like I said, please ask us any questions if you do have, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.